Hello and welcome to Digest 30. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas Fry, and Digest 30 is brought to you in part by the Louisiana Film Channel, a new television series, and SVOD, which a lot of you don't know what that is, but that's subscription video on demand service coming in 2020 to support and view Louisiana films and filmmakers. Now, Digest 30 is a series about topics that everyone wants to know more about. In other words, the things you see on the news and you get about 10 seconds of information about, and you wonder what the heck it's really all about. So the topics that we're going to be covering on Digest 30 is things that people really care about. And one of the topics that people seem to be talking about and really getting involved with, at least it's the front page of the newspaper every day, is the proposed city, it's going to come up on a map right now, called St. George. Now, St. George is a new boundary, as you can see, of a new city, and it's got a lot of controversy. The people are talking about it. They're wondering why it's happening, and today we're going to be speaking to a man that is kind of, I guess, the forefront of the hoopla around this St. George. It seems like his name pops up everywhere in all the press releases and everything, so I invite him to come on and tell the true story about why this is happening, what's the purpose of it. Now, do take in mind before you meet this young man that there are other cities that exist and coexist within and around the city of Baton Rouge, like the city of Baker. Very successful on its own, doing very well and growing. So don't think that it can't happen and flourish. Let's keep that in mind and keep an open heart as we find out more about the proposed city of St. George. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Andrew. How you doing, young man?
Good. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Pleasure's all ours. All right, so let's talk a little bit about where the idea came from. Who started the whole concept?
Initially, about 7 to 9 years ago, Norman Browning decided he was tired and fed up of our school system in East Baton Rouge Parish. A school system that has been failing for a long period of time for a variety of reasons. And he decided he wanted to see if we could establish a community school system again where kids in neighborhoods could attend the schools closest to them, as opposed to being shipped across town every morning and getting on buses at 6 a.m. and some things that didn't sound like it was quite good for education of children. So they started this process and looking into it, and what they met was resistance. People wanted to maintain, the government wanted to maintain the status quo. They did not have an interest in changing what they were doing. Mr. Browning's group went to legislature and asked for an independent school district and was met with more resistance, including our current mayor president, Mayor Broome, who told him, if you want to have a school district, you have to first form a city. He was told that not once, not twice, but more than that. And eventually he said, you know what? Maybe we should look at that. Maybe we do need to look at having a city. If you tell me the criteria for establishing an independent school district or a community school system involves forming a city, let's look at that. And that was the beginning of the St. George movement.
That was the catalyst. And the man's name was?
Norman Browning, who's currently our chairman, along with our co-chairman, Chris Riles.
It brings back memories of Brown versus the Board of Education, Mr. Browning versus the city of Baton Rouge.
Not a lot of similarities there.
Not a lot of similarities,
No.
Other than just going to be a court case, I think.
Most likely.
Most likely. All right, so it all started with education. And we all know that education is the foundation of any good community. Without education, everything falls apart. And you're right, Louisiana, I've been here for 10 years, and it's one of the worst school systems I've ever seen in education. It just seems like, especially certain parts of the community, I was told it's nothing but a pipeline to Angola. So it is something that everybody needs to be concerned with. So what were some of the things about the education system, other than just the failure rate, that prompted him to really pursue this?
I think one is looking at our neighbors. If you look around, in particular at Central and Zachary, they had the same problems the St. George area has. And once they incorporated, I'm not going to say those problems magically went away. A lot of sweat equity and work went into it. But those are now two of the top 5 ranking school districts in the state.
Right.
We met resistance from people not wanting to change the school system. And I think what our supporters and what people have learned in general in the past 3 years is education's getting worse, not better. We're now 58th in the state that's ranked dead last in education. We are near the bottom of the worst state in the country for education. And that's no longer acceptable. That's not okay.
Not a number to be proud of.
Apathy is not going to solve that problem. And so We try to work with the powers that be. Change is not something that they embrace. And so what do? We move forward with trying to establish a city, to establish our school system.
So the basis of education and better education has always been tied to, or told that it's tied to, teacher pay. Do you feel that's something that St. George is putting in their plan, that they'll be able to hire better teachers? Is that basically?
I think the idea is to fund a school system at a level that we haven't seen before. And I'll tell you, East Baton Rouge Parish doesn't have a revenue problem. They're spending more per student than almost every parish in the state. They're spending $3,000 to $4,000 more than our neighbors in Central spends per student. So it's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. It's allocating those resources where they matter most, whether it be teachers or facilities. You have some disparity in the facilities in schools. You can go to Baton Rouge High, which is magnificent. I mean, that's a beautiful facility. Lehigh is a beautiful facility. And let's go look at Terra High. Let's look at good folks at McKinley who are trying to rebuild their high school. Are these schools all getting the same level of funding as those two? Not close. Is the southeast portion of the parish getting funding for schools? Not even remotely close. Part of the disparity for us is, in the southeast portion of the parish, we have very few schools compared to the rest of the parish. They just never built schools for us.
Wow.
And so your children have to get on a bus at 6 a.m. and get shipped off to whatever school you could get into. You hope you got into Woodlawn, the one high school that's in the southeast part of the parish. And if not, you could be going as far as Scotlandville, you could be going downtown. I mean, you go anywhere, but not in your neighborhood.
Right. Well, I tell you, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to start with why, or what the city is proposing as the main objective. And I think that what we're going to see is, we're going to see a lot of numbers. You're going to see a lot of charts that show how much the city of Baton Rouge has been spending, quote from these people that are trying to incorporate their perspective on, wrongly, because you're going to see some numbers that are going to really wake you up, and we're going to let him go through that and explain it. So you stay tuned, and as soon as we come back, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this subject, and I think you'll want to watch. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Digest 30, brought to you in part by the Louisiana Film Channel, a new subscription video on demand service and weekly television series that promotes filmmaking and filmmakers in the state of Louisiana, coming in 2020. There's a quote in the proposal that I really like. It's from W. Edwards Deming. "Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Facts do matter." And what we're going to do now is give Andrew a chance to go through the facts of what is actually happening. You're going to see a lot of slides. You're not going to see a lot of us, but I want you to listen to the information he has to share. What are we about to see, and get started?
What we did was, we wanted to compile hard data. We get a lot of, unfortunately, with the way the media works today, a lot of fear-mongering and conjecture without a lot of facts supporting it. We always wanted to be able to, where I could sit up here with you and tell you something and show you a source and have you be able to independently verify it, fact check it. We wanted to be able to source information to not opinions or blogs no one's ever heard of, but substantial news features. In the case, some of the media that misquotes us is actually the media that ran some of these articles previously. We wanted people to be able to do their own research and homework, and all I ever asked was that I'm going to source all my information so you can fact check me, and I encourage it. When the opposition throws out a number, ask them where they got it from and have them source it and substantiate it. The worst thing in the world is misinformation, because people will believe what they see and hear and don't necessarily have the time to research it. So as media, and having been a former media member, I think we should be required to be good stewards of that information.
Absolutely.
And that's part of it. So what you're going to see is a slideshow compiled by our co-chairman, Chris Riles, who does a phenomenal job of researching. I think what you're going to also see is this information came from Baton Rouge, BR.gov. It came from the Business Report. It came from the Advocate. It came from J.P. Morgan.
Let's get to the slides.
Yeah.
And folks, this is not fake news. Bring up the first slide and let's let him talk about it.
One of the things we looked at when we first looked at forming a city was, what does the city spend? What's the revenue? And so what you can see is, since 2003, and this doesn't have the current budget, which is at $927 million for this year, what you see is a continual increase in spending, almost double since 2003, from a $529 million budget in 2003 to now $927 million as of 2019. And what do we have to show for that? Is the city better off than it was in 2003? Is the economy thriving? Is crime being lowered? Is our situation improved? And the answer is no. So one of our big things for St. George is benchmarking our city with other cities of like size or other cities geographically to kind of make sure where are we at on par with our neighbors, or where are we at on par with where we'd like to be. And so what you can see is Baton Rouge, we are outspending everybody.
Well, we are, aren't we?
We go up, up, and up, while you look at the other major cities in Louisiana are either static or pretty close to it, and we have a higher budget than what New Orleans is showing as actual expenditures.
Some of those are very successful cities. I mean, Alexandria, those cities are doing fine. I mean,
and this will be a hallmark of St. George's. It's not a revenue problem. It is a spending problem. It's a priority problem. And so you'll see, as we
Next slide.
move on to the next slide, we're spending more than everybody else.
Wow. Let the good times roll.
Exactly right. We're not just spending a little bit more, we're spending substantially more than our neighbors. And this is all information you'll be able to get at stgeorgelouisiana.com.
Now, is that because we're a larger city, or is that,
Well,
can they say that, or?
In some cases, you know, your Lake Charles, Lafayette, and Alexandria, we're certainly larger than them, but you're also seeing the same thing with New Orleans, that we're outpacing their spending.
Wow.
And last time I checked, I didn't think of New Orleans as a city that was particularly well run from a
Right.
government standpoint, and we're showing them just, hold my beer, I'll show you how bad I can do.
Gotcha.
Pension costs are part of the problem. We have continued to hire at I say monstrous pace. I'll also say a bloated bureaucratic system that continuously hires employees to become part of the system, because once they're in it, you can't get rid of them. They're indebted to you for their job. These are voters that are going to vote for keep maintaining the status quo every time. So we create this monster government to oversee everything, and as a result, the pension liability has gone through the roof.
Boy, in the old days, if you were a Teamster, you had a maid when you retired. But boy, now this is truly having a maid when you retire.
To give you an idea of how bloated our city parish government has become, we have as many parish employees per capita. We're on par with the city of Detroit right prior to their bankruptcy.
Wow.
We're one of the top 10 in the country for per capita city parish employees.
And in case you don't know, folks, Detroit has a lot more people.
That's
All
right.
Here's the next slide.
Bond debt is the other reason. We continuously bond out debt. We continuously write post-dated checks that we hope we can cash later. And what you've had is our bond debt has gone through the roof. Some of it's tied to the sewer system, which is another problem, the sewer upgrade. That budget has increased by hundreds of millions of dollars.
Wow.
Over budget from where it was in the beginning. So we're continuously writing checks with no idea of how we're going to pay for these checks in the future. Well, they have an idea. They do know how they're going to pay for it. They're going to increase your taxes in Baton Rouge. And so your taxes are going to continuously go up the longer Baton Rouge is in business the way they're doing business.
And we're already on par with a lot of big major cities as far as how much we're taxed already.
Well, sales taxes, which hurt the poor.
Right.
We're top 5 in the country now. We have the same level of sales tax as the city of Chicago, another
I love
city.
Baton Rouge, but it's definitely not a top 5 city. Let's see the next slide.
Debt service costs has tripled. This is something that's going to be a recurring theme, and you're going to see J.P. Morgan published a study that was published in the business report before St. George started, and it says that Baton Rouge is the 5th most over-leveraged city in the country. How do we get so over-leveraged? Debt service has tripled. Bond debt has doubled. Pension liability, $187 million. All of a sudden, these things are how you get a $927 million budget, but you don't get $927 million worth of benefit.
How in the world does this exist when you see other cities where the federal government comes in and stops it and says, hey, you guys are so upside down, your city's bankrupt?
Baton Rouge is on that path. They're on that road. They're going to be there one day, either sooner or later. They're going to hit this. Well, another reason we got there, we start dedicating taxes to everything. 38 special revenue funds have been established to a tune of $174 million. This is CATS, this is Council on Aging, this is a laundry list of things. In fact, when we first looked at this list, we had to look up and figure out what these services were. We couldn't even remember what the funds went to.
Wow.
But it's $170 million, $4 million as of last year annually that goes to these different projects. We're not saying we hate these revenue sources. We're not saying that these revenue sources aren't necessarily good expenditures of money,
needed, right.
but we want accountability for these expenses. And
Right.
now they're dedicated every year, which means we have no flexibility to address city parish needs as they arise. For example, a disaster, transportation, things like that that come up that need to be addressed immediately.
Can't
You
touch
can't
it.
do it. It's dedicated funding.
It's like
And
the Council on Aging, we just passed that new tax
That's
last
right.
year for them. They get the money, no one else can touch
That's
it.
right. And I'm not
So
saying
if the whole city floods, doesn't matter.
That's right. It's not a question of whether or not we like elderly, or
Right.
or we like the zoo, or we like cats. It's a matter of how you spend your dollars. And if somebody like the library is sitting on a $50 million surplus, perhaps it's time to review that and reduce that millage to where it's.
Or teach them how to build a building. Okay, next slide.
And so we're looking at the 20 new special revenue taxes since 2003. We've had 20 tax initiatives in the past 18 ballots, and what you're looking at is more on the way. Move BR would be a part of that. You're looking at the Greenlight Project, which Greenlight Project didn't finish 30% of the projects on their list. In fact, those 30% of the Greenlight projects were rolled into the Move BR project. So you just anticipate you're not going to get at least 30% of those projects completed, but you do get to pay the taxes till 2045.
Oh boy, what a benefit. All right, next.
But JP Morgan releases a study that says Baton Rouge, one of the 5th highest over-leveraged cities in America. We're in some categories with some dangerous places, and I'll always reference Chicago, another city I don't feel like is an example of good governance. 5th highest over-leveraged city, which means we got too much debt.
Wow.
We're carrying too much debt, too much of our budget's dedicated to it, which is going to be the scariest part is the next slide. When you're the 5th most over-leveraged, you should be paying for some of that debt, right? But we're not. We're also, according to JP Morgan, the 5th largest funding gap. We're only paying barely 50% of our required debt right now, which means we're 50% short on paying that debt. That bill is going to come due, and the best part of that is the very bottom. According to JP Morgan, over the next 30 years, the city parish is going to have to either increase your taxes by 24%, cut non-pension spending by 20%, or increase worker contributions to the system by 525%. Which one do you think the city parish is going to choose?
Think about that, folks, as we take another break and let our sponsors breathe a little bit. But it's a lot of information we're throwing at you real fast, but it's things that everyone needs to know when they go to the polls to decide about this new city that's definitely going to be on the ballot now. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to Digest 30. I'm your host, Dr. Fry, and we are delving into the city of St. George. And by the way, Digest 30 is brought to you by the Louisiana Film Channel, coming in 2020, a new weekly television series and subscription video on demand service of nothing but Louisiana filmmakers and Louisiana films. Now, this new city, of course, has a lot of information that they want to share with you. And with me, of course, is my guest today. Andrew is leading us through these slides. And we had a lot of information to begin with, and we're going to continue with those slides now. Andrew, what's the next thing we want to share with people?
Well, we talked about, before the break, we were talking about JP Morgan says the city parish of East Baton Rouge is going to have to increase your taxes. One of the choices, based on the debt they've accumulated, is they're going to have to raise your taxes by about 24%. They're raising your taxes in EBR Parish. The problem is it's for other stuff. They're not addressing their bond debt. They're not addressing their pension liability. Instead, they're creating new taxes for different things. Transportation, the hotel occupancy tax, Council on Aging, mental health, Move BR, which was on a recent ballot with a very low voter turnout in December.
Right.
You'll see a lot of new annual taxes to the tune of almost $100 million. What you don't see is any of those dedicated outside of the city parish. Police pension, which actually was rejected, and transportation, which the Metro Council rejected. All the rest of those taxes have nothing to do with pension liability or bond debt or paying down our debt service.
Understand.
But we have a lot of new taxes. What's happening with the population? This is another reason St. George came into existence, is when you start looking at census data, you can see very clearly everybody's doing well, right? Zachary's doing great, Central's doing right, Ascension's doing great, Livingston's doing great, even West Baton Rouge is doing pretty great over the river. Now, what do they all have in common? Better schools. Who's not doing so well? Let's see. Baton Rouge and Baker and East Baton Rouge Parish as a whole is almost flat population-wise. So while the areas around us are continuing to grow at exponential rates, we are seeing a decline in population. The average voter age in East Baton Rouge Parish now is over 55 years old, which means young people aren't here, they're not staying, they're not raising families here, and your kids and your grandkids aren't staying here. You are leaving for the hills, whether it's Central, Zachary, or Livingston, Ascension, or Texas, somewhere else. People are leaving left and right.
Again, this slide really spells out what we were talking about schools, because you take a class, what I consider a Class A school is Walker. I mean, they built a state-of-the-art facility, and they're attracting students from all over the whole state. Our people are moving to Walker so their kids can go to the school. And that the slide spells it all. I mean,
That's
we're
right.
seeing if our population is going to be 55 plus, that means that I don't have any children that are going to go to school, and I'm 60. So,
And an EBR Parish School System's own study reveals the same thing. They lost 3,000 students between 2010 and 2015. They just voted in the past month to close 2 schools, and we project, based on their own study, they're projecting they're going to close another 3 to 5 schools by 2025. My argument is if St. George isn't successful, they're not going to be a school system to save or change. And this is part of the lost population. It's people under the age of 65 who are getting out of college or their families from here, and they are seeing greener pastures everywhere but here. And unfortunately, I can't blame them. Part of the reason I'm involved in the city of St. George was I wanted to be confident that I could tell my children growing up, hey, it's okay to live here. It's okay to go to school here, and it's okay to grow up and have a business or work here, and you're going to be successful and have a chance at it. And right now, I can't say that. And that's what we're working towards.
okay.
How did we bench how we want to be? St. George had to look at, we can't just tell you everything's wrong. We got to tell you some solutions to problems.
Right.
And so one of those ways is benchmarking places that we think do it the way we'd like to do it. Sandy Springs, Georgia is about an hour outside of Metro Atlanta. They're fairly similarly situated population and infrastructure-wise to what we are.
Okay.
It's not a city starting from scratch. They had some infrastructure. They have 100,000 population. We're kind of close to that in St. George. And what they did was they said, if we don't need it, why do we have it? How do you avoid pension liability? You privatize as many services as you can where it makes sense. This doesn't mean everything's private for the sake of being private. This means you look at a cost-benefit analysis and say, you know what, is it more responsible for me to hire somebody to mow the grass and it's an employee of the parish or the city, or is it a better use of my funds to hire a lawn service when needed? I don't have to maintain equipment.
Right.
I don't have to maintain the pension liability. They're going to pay a 401k hopefully to that employee and benefits, and that's their responsibility. And you know what? If they're really bad at mowing the lawn, I'll terminate that contract the next day and hire somebody else. And what Sandy Springs saw, over the course of a decade, several things happened. Did their experiment work? Well, they never raised their budget in a decade. For the first time last year, they finally raised their budget. Why'd they do it? They had a $50 million surplus in the bank.
Wow.
They didn't raise taxes during that period of time. And what they learned was over the course of time, businesses bidding for services and public contracts will be competitive, and that reduced their cost. Their expenses actually went down over time simply because people were bidding. Multiple companies are bidding to mow the lawn. Multiple companies are bidding
Sure.
to do maintenance.
Common sense.
Exactly right.
Right.
Some of our attributes that we intend to employ in St. George, I've kind of briefly gone over it, is a public-private partnership. The only offices we're going to hire, our intention is only to hire, are the ones that are constitutionally mandated. So you've got a mayor, you've got, I think, a city clerk, you've got a chief of police, only because we're required to have one, and you've got your city council. Outside of that, we're going to have a private management group administrate our city for us. So you have consistency from one administration to the next. So the example we've been getting from the opposition lately is look at Central. They just elected a new mayor and a whole new city. They cleaned house.
Right.
Exactly right. Because that population was small enough and they were tired, they didn't like what they had, and they went to the polls and they voted on it. That is the American way. That's a fundamental right.
Right.
I'm glad they're able to do that because we don't feel like we can do that. which is how we got to St. George. But the administrative function, having that privatized, means from one administrator to the next, you have that guidelines. They don't make decisions, but they make recommendations, and they help you procure contracts and services at a cheaper rate. And that'll keep some consistency from time to time, so you don't have elections where the administration turns over and everybody's, we start in business from scratch.
Let's talk a little bit about your concept of privatizing. You said a chief of police. Are you still going to have a police force that's paid for by your city, or are you going to contract it out with EBR's police force that already exists?
Well, in St. George, another misconception we get is you're going to lose city services when you leave the unincorporated part of the parish and you incorporate. We've always enjoyed the EBR Sheriff's Office. The Baton Rouge City Police Department, despite the fact that my tax dollars go to pay their pensions, they don't cross Essen to go to my neighborhood. We don't get Baton Rouge City Police. We only get the Sheriff's Department, and that's what we want to maintain. It seems like a misuse of funds to redundancy to have a police force and a Sheriff's Department when we feel like Sheriff Gautreaux is doing a great job. He's an elected official, so he's accountable to the voters. He's got resources, and instead of trying to divide resources and put some money over here for a couple of police officers, it's better spent allocating, which we did in our budget, an additional $4 million to the Sheriff's Office and say, Sheriff Gautreaux, how do we make St. George safer? What do you want to do? Put extra deputies on the ground for St. George, build a substation. These are things that Sheriff Gautreaux can decide to do that will help fund, as opposed to splitting money across different areas.
Well, let's talk about the other emergency service, fire service. How is it going to work?
St. George Fire Department is more than happy to tell you that the fire service is going to exist in St. George as it always has since they were created, whether we're successful or not. That St. George Fire Department is an independent taxing district, and those tax dollars are to benefit the unincorporated area of the area of St. George. So just like the mall and LaBerge and Our Lady of the Lake, they got annexed by Baton Rouge. They're still getting St. George Fire Department protection, and they're still paying the St. George Fire Department tax because the city of Baton Rouge can't afford to service them. Our governance model, as we were talking, we're required by the state constitution to have, so you got to have a mayor, you got to have a chief of police, you got to have a city clerk, a city treasurer. That's about it. 4 to 5 employees are all you're required to have as a city. So why, for example, would we hire, let's look at the parish attorney's office as a great example because they're in the news a lot lately.
Okay.
Is that a good expense of money to have that department in that capacity getting paid that money? Or would you be better off privatizing that and giving contracts out to high-powered law firms that you can pay the same amount of money to or less to get the job done as needed?
Absolutely.
And that's part of the issue is why have it if you don't have, just because government has always done things this way does not mean it has to be this way in the future. The Legislative Auditor's Office has just showed us that 7 cities have been taken over by the state already, and more are coming. Why is that? They continue to do the same things over and over again. That's insanity. And we're looking at a different path forward with a smaller footprint and a smaller governance model. So hopefully we return tax dollars to you as opposed to keeping them for ourselves.
So it's going to be a very small city hall.
Very small city hall. I wouldn't even anticipate thinking about it. A city hall concept for a while.
It's in the Starbucks. Okay, got
exactly.
it. Okay.
This is more about the St. George governance model. And one of the things we continuously hear from the mayor's office is we're going to lose city services. A lot of these are parish services that we already pay taxes for. Your water and your sewer is not going to change. Your garbage collection is not going to change. Unfortunately, your mosquito control is not going to change. A lot of these services are parish-wide. Animal control, BREC, these services remain no matter what. If St. George is successful, you still get these services. If we fail, you still get these services. Now, what might change in the future is how these services are contracted for and how the partnership works. Because all of a sudden you'll have someone else at the table to say, I think mosquito abatement's a little out of control.
Okay.
You'll have some issues with some of the contracts in the future, but that's not a St. George issue. That's the parish negotiating contracts like they've always been.
So BREC would still control the parks and
BREC is still BREC. We're still part of East Baton Rouge Parish. So if East Baton Rouge Parish is a tax and we all pay for it, we all share in it. What's going to change for St. George is where do those tax dollars, where does the discretionary tax dollars go? 2-cent sales tax, property tax, where does that money go? It won't go into the general fund and the coffers for the parish government to spend as they see fit on studies to nowhere about nothing. Instead, it'll go back into St. George City where we're going to allocate that money according to what our taxpayers want.
So for a Kansas boy, basically they're a county entity and not a city entity.
Think of it this way. St. George, we're 2/3 of the tax revenue for the parish. We're getting less than 1/3 in return.
Thus you want your own city.
Correct.
Next slide.
Our boundary lines, this is the boundary lines for 2018. You can see we shrank our footprint. It is another source of attack for the opposition. Our footprint shrank from the first time around. The first time around we said if it's unincorporated, we want to incorporate it into the city of St. George. And what we learned is, well, one, we weren't successful. Two, we could go back and review the petition signatures and withdrawals on a precinct by precinct basis and say, hey, they had less than 25% of support for St. George. We know we need 25% support. We're not going to include a group that doesn't support us. That just seems like we're trying to force them to do something they don't want to do. So they were excluded. And if it wasn't contiguous to us, it was also excluded. Part of that, it was in response to the petition process and who supported it. Part of it's in turn part of the revenue process. We had to have a city we could afford.
Right.
And when they took annexed LaBerge, Arlay the Lake, and Walmart Marketplace, they took revenue from us. That's absolutely correct.
The Mall, Louisiana.
That's right, the Mall, Louisiana. You know what's funny about the Mall, for example, is the Mall was not originally contiguous to the city of Baton Rouge. So
Right.
in theory, they can't annex it. So they could have annexed a neighborhood along the way, a subdivision right there by Wards Creek.
Right.
No, they chose to annex only Wards Creek, so they could touch Walmart or touch the mall, and they could annex the mall
It
and
was
annex
creative.
Walmart.
Legally, it was very creative.
And it had nothing to do with taxpayers and citizens. It had everything to do with revenue.
Absolutely had to do with money. And this is the city's fight to keep the revenue up.
That's right. And part of the smaller footprint allows us to create a city with a surplus, which was always our goal, to have more revenue than we spend so we can save money and finance our own projects, for example, instead of bond them out. It was also in response to the loss of revenue, but also other cities, like Hoover, Alabama is a great example. They tried the same way we did. If it's unincorporated, we'll take it, and it failed.
Right.
You come back with a smaller footprint, and after you're successful, we can look at neighborhoods and HOAs and say, hey, if you apply for annexation, let's talk about that.
Right.
We get a lot of phone calls and emails about how do we get into St. George? We're unincorporated. You didn't include us. Well, be patient. And we have some from the city of Baton Rouge that want out, that want in, and I'm not sure we can help those folks.
It's a crazy thing that they did, and it all had to do with money. And that opposition we're going to talk about in the next segment. But let's get through a couple more slides real quick. Here's your operating budget.
That's right. Our operating budget. We project originally our estimates based on information we got from br.gov, estimated revenue at $58 million. The city parish even concedes in their own research that we're going to generate $45 million, and we believe it's closer to an actuality of $48 million after getting more information from the city. Our expenses, we don't estimate to be any more than $34 million. I'm not sure how someone can sit there with a straight face and tell us, because the argument the city keeps giving us is we're not going to have enough revenue. We have too many expenses. We'll have to increase taxes. If that's the city's argument, why are they fighting so hard to keep us? It seems like we're doing them a favor by taking this burden on for them. And the other time, they'll tell you that we're not going to generate enough revenue. And we tell you that this is based on their own information they put out at br.gov. All this information is accessible and was accessible before the open checkbook concept came out. Our revenue is tied to taxes you can find out about in our area. It's not an exact total because businesses change every year,
Sure.
Assessments change every year, but it's $45 million. If that's our low-ball number, sounds good to me because we have revenue estimated expenses at $34 million. Part of that's because that's the expenses we're going to incur from the parish-wide taxes.
Right.
Part of that's our estimate based on our expenses that we're required to have, the constitutionally mandated offices. Outside of that, we're not going to do business the same way Baton Rouge does. $927 million budget's what they throw out for the entire parish. That's because they've mismanaged money. They're spending it incorrectly. They're having taxes on the wrong things instead of prioritizing where the tax revenue should go. We don't intend to ever do that. And if you don't do that and you have a third-party administrator help you facilitate that, your revenue and your expenses are going to be just fine. And if we're running a $14 million surplus annually, that sounds like a pretty good system of government. That sounds like we might be able to cut taxes, not raise taxes.
It definitely looks that way, doesn't it? we got one more. You're going to do City of St. George promises.
We're telling you we want to be good stewards of your tax dollars. We feel like the citizens of St. George, and we're all in that category, have spent a lot of tax revenue over the years and continue to increase the tax revenue, taxes we're getting hit with, and we're not getting a return on that taxes. We typically have low-performing schools in our area. We have less schools than everyone else and a failing school system. Crime is getting worse every single day. We're not getting a return on our expenses. Our streets are dilapidated. We feel like we're going to deliver to taxpayers a transparent government. You'll be able to see what we spend, how we spend it, and why we spend it. You're going to see that our priorities are in line, because it's going to be about taking care of the priorities for our area, as opposed to creating new taxing districts and new revenue streams for our friends and family, say for the Council on Aging, for example. It's about being a good steward of your tax dollars. And I think if we do that and show that, and all the research we've done indicates that the city can be run expeditiously in a manner that we should be able to return tax dollars. The sales tax for us is through the roof. The top 5 in the country is not good.
Absolutely.
And if I would have proposed a tax like that, I would be criticized for being a racist, because it inadvertently hurts lower income families in North Baton Rouge.
Right.
But that's exactly what went on the ballot. Well, that's something we don't even intend to do in St. George. We intend on lowering sales taxes and becoming more competitive with our neighbors. If we treat it more like a business with a public component to it, then you should be benchmarking and looking. For example, there's a great billboard. It's on I-12 at O'Neill for Boat City, USA. I hate to shout out to a company, but they got a low sales tax in Hammond of 7.45%. And they tell you, come buy a boat because it's cheaper. That's about 3% cheaper than the EBR sales tax.
Right.
You buy a $20,000 boat, that makes a difference.
Sure it does.
If your business is located in EBR and not in St. George, because I talk to a lot of East Baton Rouge businesses that have nothing to do with St. George, why does it benefit them for us to be successful? Because we can reverse that trend. There's not a Juban crossing, for example, if we're successful.
Right.
Because people don't leave. And if they don't leave, they spend their tax dollars here, they buy cars here. If we lower the cost of school for middle income families where they can return to public schools, that's $10,000 to $12,000 per child per family annually. That's money that's cars, that's money that buys food, that's discretionary income, that's staycations, that's beneficial to the parish as a whole. So we're going to raise all ships in St. George if we're successful, just like Central and Zachary are doing, just like Baker's working to do.
All right, let's take another break, and then we'll come back for our final segment and tie this thing up and look into the actual plan of what they plan to do as far as actually building this city and operating it. So stay tuned. We'll be back more about the new proposed city of St. George. Welcome back to Digest 30. I'm Dr. Fry, your host, and of course this is brought to you in part by the new Louisiana Film Channel coming in the year 2020, which is a weekly television series and a subscription video on demand service promoting Louisiana films and filmmakers. This is a public affairs show that we do to enlighten you about the real stories that matter. And this story that we're dealing with, as you've learned over the last half hour, is about the proposed city of St. George. And Andrew has taken the time to be with us today. And one of the critical things that really affects your decision making as a viewer of this television station on proposed changes and things that are coming up on the ballot is the facts. And the news media is really good at telling you their opinion or quote their fact that they've checked. But let's ask the horse's mouth exactly what are some of the things that you've heard in the media or seen or politicians have quoted that really aren't true that you'd like to readdress. Andrew, what are some of the things that you've heard out there?
All right, it's a long list. I'll start with the.
We got a lot of time. Go ahead.
I'll start with the most infamous one, that this is a breakaway movement.
A breakaway movement.
They've coined that term, they've run with it, and they just keep throwing it out there, hoping it sticks.
What is this, Croatia?
St. George can't be a breakaway. We're unincorporated. We're the same equivalent of any unincorporated area, rural area, who decides they've got enough people and they want to form their own city. We're not leaving East Baton Rouge Parish. Every tax dollar that we generate stays in East Baton Rouge Parish. We're not leaving the city. We're just trying to form a suburb, just a little city of our own out of the unincorporated area that currently doesn't get...
Are you already part of the city of Baton Rouge?
No, we've never been part of the city of Baton Rouge. In fact, the city of Baton Rouge has had about 40 to 50 years where they could have annexed the unincorporated area and chose not to. And they have no intentions of annexing anything other than business
Well, then
revenue.
why are they upset that you're wanting to incorporate? How does this affect them if you was not part of them now?
Takes me to another misconception that we're going to bankrupt the parish. I've heard multiple numbers on what we're going to. The other day, it's going to cost the parish $100 million if St. George breaks away a year.
Okay,
Well,
how's that?
We just went over a couple of segments ago the projected revenue for the city of St. George. Our number is 48 million. The city parishes is 45. So how can we effectively take 100 million when your own number says it's less than half that? And what they don't tell you is we're also taking those expenses off the table too. You're no longer responsible for our public works issues. You're no longer responsible for our city roads. You're no longer responsible for some of the maintenance and costs that goes into St. George, because St. George is going to bear that cost as a city, just like Central and Zachary and Baker do.
Right.
And when they incorporated, did they bankrupt the parish? No. In fact, if anything, they dramatically improved the parish and the future for the parish. We saw that when we talked about population and where people live, Central and Zachary. So another thing is we're not going to have enough schoolroom, school capacity. Now, there's two parts to this. Number one, the EBR Parish School Board did no one any favors by not building any schools in southeast Baton Rouge. They didn't. They built all the schools in the other parts of the parish.
Okay.
That's fine. Because of the declining student population, which is their fault, we're going to have a projected total of about 5,300 students, and we've got capacity for 5,200. We're 100 short, not the thousands they're telling you. We're 100 people short, 100 students short. That's, last time I checked, about 4 T buildings, which is something EBR Parish loves to put on their property.
Sure.
I can go to Westminster and see the T buildings that are no longer T because they've been there for about a decade. They've talked about how it's going to affect the flood dollars.
Oh, yeah.
That was
I heard that one.
the first one I heard, which is silly, and it's irresponsible journalism to have run that. Flood dollars aren't controlled by the city. That's a state and federal issue, and now we're 3 years later, so it's not even relevant at this juncture. They're just it's a racist movement.
Oh.
We're all a bunch of white Republican racists out there, and we're trying to separate because we don't want to be around black people.
Really?
I can tell you that
What is the racial breakdown of
St. George demographic is almost going to match Baton Rouge High's demographic. It's going to be about an equal split between white to black, with an Asian population and a Hispanic population. Just like it's going to be actually the most diverse city in the state. Diversity doesn't mean all of one thing.
Right.
Diversity means a mix, and we're going to have a perfect mix for population in our area. It had nothing to do with race because originally we chose to incorporate everything that was unincorporated. We tried to incorporate the entire unincorporated area. What we left out is based on demand and response and revenue. We have never once in any meeting I've ever attended talked about race being a factor as a decision that we were making for St. George. They throw it out there because they're desperate. They don't have any facts to go with. It's easy, and it's an inflammatory term that's going to rile up people and cause them to hate without actually looking at the facts of the case. It's just like I've told everyone. I will always tell you information, and I will base it on a source or a fact. I will give you that source and fact. I will make it available to you at stgeorgelouisiana.com. I'll send it to you in email or talk to you about it on the phone. I'll always source my information. You can always look it up and check it. I ask that you do the same thing when the opposition throws out something, because they will go all over the place until they find the nerve that strikes to you, and they will hit that. We're going to bankrupt the city of Baton Rouge, or we're not going to have enough money in St. George, so we're going to have to tax everyone. Your taxes are going up. We can't do both.
Can't do both.
Pick an argument, stick with it.
And you're not going to build a wall.
We're not building a wall. We're going to benefit the parish.
All right, let's talk about what physically happens if you become a city, because a lot of people, they're not aware of actually how your government's going to get started.
There is a lot that entails creation of a city. It doesn't just mean we got the signatures and we're a city. As we said
Put
before,
Bob in charge.
exactly. As we said before, when you get the signatures mandated to get on the ballot, that's
Right.
all you've done.
Right.
We've gotten past step one. We're now going to be placed on a ballot, absent frivolous litigation. We'll be placed on a ballot, and the citizens in the St. George area only the affected people, will have an opportunity to vote yes or no.
By the way, the date of that election is on the screen right now. You can see when you're going to go vote on this. Now,
that's right.
But let's say it becomes a city. Who decides who's in charge?
At that point, the governor does. So he places on the ballot, and we go to our election. And at that point, we're going to vote yay or nay, and we vote yes. We're very confident that if we get on when we get on the ballot, that we're going to be approved. It's just going to happen.
Right.
At that point, the governor is going to have the option. He's going to appoint the interim mayor and interim city council, and then set a special election at that point. Or if a regular election's coming up, he'll put that on the ballot so we can vote for our first ever actual elected mayor and city council.
So the persons that he puts on the council, they have to be residents of your city?
Yes, they would be just
That's
like
kinda nice.
Yeah, just like any other city council member,
Right.
they have to be residents of that district, and it'll fall along the same lines as that.
So you guys will have your own city elections and everything that,
Yep.
that hoopla and signs in everybody's yard?
That's right. We'll get to have all the election fun that Central, Zachary, and Baker get to have. And at that point, we'll have our first elected administration. During that interim, it's a transition government, and that transition government is tasked with starting to procure some bids for services. We're also going to legislature to transfer tax revenue to the city.
Right.
Once you become a city, that switch doesn't flip on day one and all the money's in the bank and you got to
Right.
transition the money to the bank. We have to transition the school board, the school system to St. George Independent School District or whatever the name will be. And at that point, as those revenues are coming over, we're transitioning from a transition government to the first St. George government. It won't be unlike what people saw in Central.
We've got just under a minute here. How long do you think this would take if the city is approved?
Transition government shouldn't last any longer. 6 months would be great. A year would probably be the worst case scenario. It depends on litigation.
All right. If you want to find out more information about this topic, is there any particular way that people can find out information about what's going on?
The great thing about the world we live in, you can go to stgeorgelouisiana.com.
An internet site.
That's right.
Yes.
All of our information is available there. You can also find a phone number to contact us. I'll probably call you back. You can also email me. I'll probably email you back. We're also on Facebook, and you can always get our information there. We're pretty prodigious Facebook users.
Thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate it. Thank
Folks,
you so
I hope
much.
you enjoy the premiere episode of Digest 30, and we'll see you next time.